When NASA went live on November 19th to discuss the interstellar visitor known as 3I Atlas, the broadcast carried a heaviness that couldn't be explained by the technical language or the measured tone of the speakers. It wasn't what they said that drew attention, but what they consistently avoided. The atmosphere felt carefully controlled, as if the real substance of the briefing existed just beyond the edges of what they allowed the audience to see. They spoke at length, moving through long lists of spacecraft, instruments, observation windows, and procedural notes, yet at the end of these explanations, the viewer was left with remarkably little. For an object that had drifted into our solar system from the gulf between the stars, the clarity people expected simply wasn't offered. The images they displayed were faint and unimpressive, distant specks, blurred smudges of light, vague halos that could have been anything if not for the captions beneath them. They emphasized repeatedly that much of the data had not been downlinked yet, or not processed, or still needed calibration. Almost every reference to Hubble, Webb, Lucy, Psyche, Maven, and the rest came wrapped in disclaimers that the images weren't ready, the angles weren't ideal, or the onboard instruments were working at the extreme edge of their capabilities. It created a peculiar pattern. For every mention of how much data they had, there was an equal mention of why none of it could be shown. Meanwhile, there was a phrase that echoed throughout the entire broadcast, weaving itself between topics like a steady drumbeat: 3I Atlas is just a comet. The insistence grew noticeable, repeated so consistently that it began to feel less like a scientific conclusion and more like a narrative boundary. At moments it felt rehearsed, as though the primary objective of the livestream wasn't transparency, but tone management. The idea was simple: before any new images, before any new details, before addressing rumors or unexplained behaviors, the audience was gently guided into accepting the official category of the object. A comet. Only a comet. Nothing more. And yet the silence around specific details felt louder than that repeated reassurance. The stream ended, leaving behind a lingering sense that the most important pieces were kept carefully out of sight. When something enters our solar system from interstellar space, something untouched by our sun, shaped by a system older than our own, the expectation is clarity, directness, a willingness to show the raw material and walk the public through whatever uncertainties exist. But the November 19th stream drifted around the essential points in a way that made the empty space between the words feel strangely intentional. And sometimes in science, silence becomes part of the discovery, a shadow cast not by withholding, but by discomfort. Throughout the broadcast, NASA listed nearly 20 spacecraft that had looked at 3I Atlas from different vantage points and wavelengths. That alone should have been thrilling, a rare synchronized observation campaign spanning deep space probes, Earth orbiters, and ground telescopes. But instead of showing the audience the mosaic of perspectives, NASA showed only a handful of cropped frames, dim, uninformative, almost generic in appearance. They spoke about science wiggles, about the complex spectral lines they had collected, about high-resolution stacks and wavelength corrections, but the visual evidence stayed off-screen. It felt like hearing someone describe the colors of a painting without ever being allowed to see the canvas. The missing images weren't the only curious detail. Some of the scientific points they mentioned were delivered almost too quickly, as if to acknowledge them without drawing attention. They mentioned an unusually high ratio of carbon dioxide compared to water vapor, a nickel abundance that didn't quite match that of known comets, polarization patterns in the dust that didn't align with typical models, and the possibility that 3I Atlas originated in a star system older than the Sun. These are big statements, not your don't. Each one deserving a slow, careful explanation. Yet every time a detail like that surfaced, the speakers redirected the conversation back to generalities. The tone of the event never faltered. Calm, smooth, consistent. Even when addressing the most unusual findings, there was no moment of genuine surprise, no acknowledgement that any part of this object's behavior was unexpected. The steadiness became almost uncanny. It felt less like an open scientific briefing and more like a carefully moderated reassurance campaign, a tightening of the narrative frame around a phenomenon that might otherwise invite speculation. NASA explained that many instruments had to be pushed beyond their design parameters to see the object, hinting gently that artifacts or distortions could appear. They said that several spacecraft had to turn at awkward angles, risking glare or stray light. They said that partial data might mislead the public if released early, so it was better to wait. On the surface, each reason sounded rational, but taken together they formed a pattern of distancing, not from the science, but from the public's access to it. They made it clear that there was a huge amount of data. They repeated that the observations spanned different distances, filters, instruments, and angles. They insisted that everything is being studied carefully. But the live stream delivered only fragments, curated, softened, uncontroversial. The rest was tucked behind gentle reminders to be patient, to trust the process, to wait for the researchers to finish their work. The long list of what they had collected contrasted sharply with the tiny amount they actually showed. That contrast created a silence heavier than any conspiracy theory, any rumor, any online speculation. The silence didn't feel like secrecy, it felt like reluctance. A hesitation rooted not in deception, but in scientific uncertainty, institutional caution, or the burden of interpreting something that didn't fit neatly into familiar categories. By the final minutes of the live stream, this silence became the defining feature. The interesting questions were the ones that received the softest answers. Whenever a topic brushed up against the unusual, the object's possible shape, its chemical anomalies, its likely age, its non-gravitational behavior, the replies dissolved into a blur of careful phrases, too early to know, still under analysis, data still being processed. Science often takes time, that is normal. But here, the gradualness didn't feel like a natural pace of research, it felt like a deliberate effort to avoid stepping outside a safe narrative, as if acknowledging the strangeness too openly would open a door they weren't ready to walk through, on camera. 3i Atlas was repeatedly labeled ordinary, yet the details they rushed past hinted at something far older, more complex, and more unusual than the public was allowed to focus on. The idea that it may have formed in a system predating our sun was mentioned only briefly, despite the immense implications. The strange chemistry, touched on and then abandoned. The polarization in the dust, referenced but never explained. Even the subtle shifts in its trajectory, which could reveal much about its internal structure, were passed off as routine, though such forces vary significantly between comets. Each small anomaly flickered into view like a signal buried in static, visible only for a moment before the discussion drifted back to safer territory. When the live stream finally ended, what lingered wasn't frustration or suspicion, it was the recognition that NASA seemed uncomfortable with the story still unfolding behind the scenes. Maybe they didn't want to inflate speculation, maybe they didn't want to misinterpret the early data, maybe they didn't want a repeat of the sensationalism that surrounded Oumuamua, which many scientists later regretted letting spiral into public imagination. Or maybe the real issue is that interstellar objects simply don't fit neatly into familiar frameworks, forcing scientists into a strange balancing act between honesty and caution. Whatever the reason, the silence around 3i Atlas became part of the mystery. When something enters the solar system carrying the chemical fingerprints of a place we've never seen, shaped by a star older than ours, behaving in ways that are familiar but not identical to local comets, public curiosity is inevitable. You don't need conspiracies to find the situation intriguing. The scientific oddities are compelling on their own. As 3i Atlas continues its outward journey, we're left with more questions than answers. Why did NASA emphasize what they couldn't show rather than what they could? Why did the strongest details come wrapped in disclaimers? Why were entire segments of the data mentioned only to be brushed aside? Why did the briefing feel more like boundary setting than exploration? These are not accusations, they are observations. NASA is an institution of brilliant scientists, but also one bound by caution, public relations, and the need for consensus before making strong claims. And when studying something from beyond the sun, something ancient and unfamiliar, scientific hesitation can sound like intentional quietness. But that quietness is part of the story. Sometimes the most interesting things in astronomy aren't the discoveries themselves, but the shadows around them. The places where data resists easy interpretation, where scientists tread carefully, where the universe hands us something that doesn't quite fit. If you sense the same tension between what was said and what seemed deliberately unsaid, you're not imagining it. There is a subtle, unmistakable dissonance between the abundance of data and the scarcity of revelations. That doesn't mean NASA is hiding something dramatic. It means they may be standing at the threshold of a discovery they don't yet fully understand, and that, in many ways, is even more compelling. This channel exists for those moments, the quiet gaps where official narratives thin out, where mystery grows in the silence, where the universe feels close enough to touch but too vast to fully grasp. If you're listening not just to the statements but to the pauses around them, then you're already part of the investigation. Stay close. More is coming.